Alrighty. Good afternoon and welcome everybody to today's webinar. My name is Salil Gokhale. I'm a principal engineer with Applied Research Associates and I'm based in Austin. And on behalf of the Association of Transportation Professionals of Indian Origin, or ATPIO in short, we welcome you to today's webinar on preserving the value of transportation assets through asset management. Next slide, please. Okay. So just to give you a brief introduction about ATPIO, we are a nonprofit organization. We've been around since 2004, and we are a organization that was set up to facilitate the enhancement of transportation systems and services in India, and mainly to foster collaboration amongst academia, private and public sectors. Our membership is predominantly made up of academicians and industry professionals in the US, and we're aligned with several organizations in India, including the Transportation Research Group and several others. Most of us do this as part-time on a non-profit basis, and we hold annual meetings at TRB. We sponsor or co-sponsor workshops, and we also sometimes sponsor students when they come to the US for different conferences. Please do look us up on LinkedIn through the ATPIO group, and also check out our website at www.atpio.org. Today I'm joined by my good friend Prashant Ram from Applied Pavement Technology. And I'd also like to take a moment to acknowledge and thank Applied Pavement Technology, or AppTech in short, for hosting today's webinar. Next slide, please. Okay, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome today's speaker, Ms. Katie Zimmerman. She is the founder and Executive Vice President of Applied Pavement Technology. She's based in Urbana-Champaign in Illinois. And she has a wealth of experience of over 40 years of working in the pavement engineering industry, and she's a renowned expert and one of the most respected persons in this field. So please join me in welcoming Ms. Katie Zimmerman, and her topic for today's presentation is preserving the value of transportation assets through asset management. And just before we get started, I'd like to turn it over to Prashant for some announcements regarding today's webinar.
Thank you, Salil. Just a couple of quick housekeeping items. So all the attendees today will receive a 1-hour PDF certificate. So that should be automatically be sent to you in a week or so after the webinar concludes. So in case you do not receive the PDF certificate, I will put an email address in the chat box so you can send me a note. Then we'll make sure we'll get that to you. And then as we go through this webinar, we encourage people to come up with questions. So please use the questions box to post any questions you may have, and we will have a 10-minute Q&A session at the very end of this webinar. So with that, I will turn it over to Katie to walk us through our presentation today.
All right. And hopefully you can all see my screen now.
Yes, Katie.
All right, fantastic. All right, well, I'm really honored to be here today, and I want to thank Prashant for the invitation. I'm hoping that through my presentation, you'll find something of interest so that maybe you'll be intrigued to get more into asset management as your careers progress. There are 3 things that I hope that you're able to get out of this session. The first is I want to introduce you to some of the basic principles and practices associated with transportation asset management, which is a growing field of study that agencies are using to help them better take care of their assets, pavements, bridges, all of the other assets that they maintain. Secondly, since the presentation does focus on preserving the value of your assets, I want to talk a little bit about why it's important to preserve that asset value and how you might go about doing that. And then perhaps selfishly, I'm hoping that you find some ideas for an exciting way that you might be able to enhance your career by getting more involved in the asset management field. So the presentation title talks about preserving the value of your assets. So I included this slide just to give you some idea of the magnitude of the assets that transportation agencies are maintaining. So this slide is from the Ohio Department of Transportation, and they estimated that it would cost at least $116 billion to replace the assets that it manages. So that represents a huge level of investment that they have in their transportation system. And you can see that that's heavily made up of pavements, but also bridges, conduits, and other kinds of assets related to traffic signals, signs, lighting, traffic aids, all of those kinds of things. And this represents a huge number. So it's really important that transportation agencies do the best they can to manage those assets as effectively as possible. Now, there are a lot of different types of transportation agencies that use asset management practices and face some challenges in trying to manage these networks. You can be talking about state departments of transportation, local agencies like cities or counties, airports, transit authorities. So there are a lot of agencies that are managing transportation assets, and they're all doing the best that they can. But there are some significant challenges that they deal with as they try to do this. So in many cases, the networks are deteriorating, demand for the network is increasing, agencies don't have as much money as they do needs, so they're trying to figure out, how do I use the money as best I can? There are a lot of competing priorities. How do you decide whether you should be investing in bridges or pavements or providing better transit options for people instead of road options? Those are all different and competing priorities that they're trying to deal with. Public expects a lot of the transportation system, but lately we've also started seeing workforce and supply chain issues that are impacting what they can actually get done. So I'm going to give you guys an opportunity to have a poll and answer a question, give you a simple illustration of the kinds of choices that transportation agencies have to make. But of course, it's scaled down considerably. So Prashant, can you pull up the poll for us? All right, I'm not seeing the poll, Prashant. So if you want to, is it up there?
It should be up there. I launched it, so.
All right. Well, maybe because I'm in presentation mode, I can't see it.
I can see it. I can see it.
Okay, great. So I've given you three options, and I don't know the exact wording because I'm not seeing it on my screen, but there's three simple examples for you. So I want to see, if you were given $400 today, what would you choose to do with that money? Would you choose to buy a treat for yourself, something like a new bike, or go out to a concert, or do whatever? Or would you do some repairs that are needed to something that you already own? So for example, if you have a bike, might you upgrade that? If you own a home, is it something that you've always wanted to do to your home that you could upgrade? Or thirdly, would you do some long delayed maintenance that's needed on something else, maybe a car, a bike, something like that? So I'm going to give you guys a few minutes, and Prashant, when you get some responses, if you could summarize them for me, that'd be great.
Sounds good, Kerry. We have a 94% response rate so far. I'm going to give it just a few more seconds, and then I will display the responses. All right, so if the responses are in, and then what we see here is that 25% responded that they would treat their self-care to concert tickets, new clothes, trip, and then only 6% said they would replace their old phones. And an overwhelming majority, almost 70%, said they would do the maintenance that they've postponed on their home, car, bike, etc.
Fantastic. So what that tells me is some of you maybe have been doing your maintenance all along. So those 25% that are going to treat themselves, they've probably been maintaining their assets, and so they can afford a little treat to themselves. But it looks like the majority of you already have a handle on the fact that you've got to continue to maintain these assets over time to keep them in good operating condition. So these examples that we included there are sort of representative of some of the kinds of choices that agencies are making. The one about having a treat might be sort of like having a new road added to your network, something like that. Replacing your phone. You have something that's deteriorated and you want to bring it back up to perfect condition. But the deferred maintenance is something that a lot of agencies are facing, and they're trying to address that. All right. So the thing that agencies are trying to do is they're asking the question of where do I spend my money? What do I choose to do? And how do I use the money as wisely as possible? Do I try to invest in things that will reduce congestion, or do I try to maintain my bridges? What kinds of choices do you make? Now, historically, in the past, the way that agencies managed their network was what we call the worst first strategy. They would build an asset or they would install an asset. They would let it deteriorate over time. And once it had deteriorated, they did major rehabilitation or some expensive repair to bring it back up to near perfect condition, and then they let it deteriorate again. And over time, that became a very expensive way of taking care of your assets. But it was encouraged in part because funding from FHWA, the Federal Highway Administration, for taking care of your assets required assets to be deteriorated before you could get money for them. Now that has since changed, but this was the old way that agencies maintained. So they were constantly letting things deteriorate and then they would repair them. So that historical approach really has led us to the point where we're at today, where we have a lot of unfunded needs that haven't been addressed. We're fighting a lot of emergency repairs. There's more reacting to what's happening rather than planning, and agencies are having a hard time moving away from this worst first strategy. So more recently, we've changed to what we're calling a preservation strategy, where we might use preventive maintenance treatments earlier in an asset's life. And what that does is they're lower cost treatments that provide some marginal improvement to the pavement, but keep it in better condition for a longer period of time. And this has been encouraged by Federal Highway Administration, which now provides funding for preservation activities and supports this type of a philosophy in asset management. So the key to managing these assets effectively is to be using these preservation approaches, which are much more cost effective than the worst first strategy that I introduced to you previously. And if you have trouble understanding it, it's kind of like the approach that you use for taking care of your car, your house, even your teeth. All of these, if you do maintenance along the way, you can preserve their condition for a longer period of time. So putting it in a framework that people can understand seems to really help them understand what asset management is all about. So agencies that are using asset management see a lot of benefits. They're lowering the cost of what it costs to maintain their system over time. They're making better use of the dollars that they have. They also have better information for justifying what their needs are. So when they request funding for their projects, they actually have reliable information that they can use. Asset management also helps agencies make sure that what they are investing in are aligned with the agency's strategic priorities. And as a result of that, they mitigate some of their major risks and improve transparency in their decision processes. So let's spend a couple minutes just talking about what transportation asset management actually is. And this is an older definition for asset management that I'm going to give you guys a minute to read, and you'll notice that I've colored some key words to that definition. So it's strategic and systematic. So to me, that means that you're thinking big picture. You're thinking beyond just the current environment. You're thinking what's going to be needed in the future, and you're attacking it from a systematic approach. So you're not just throwing things out there. You actually have a process for how you're managing your network. It focuses not just on the engineering needs, but it also focuses on the business side of things. What benefits can we return? What makes sense from a cost-effective perspective? In the end, asset management is all about allocating and using available resources and supporting better decision-making, having quality information, and well-defined objectives to support your approach. Asset management emphasizes a whole life approach that recognizes that an asset's going to have different needs depending on where it is in its life cycle. And it's similar to the decision to buy. In the old days, you could get incandescent light bulbs, and then now there are LED light bulbs available. Those LED light bulbs are a lot more expensive, but when you think about them over their entire life, it's actually a lot less expensive than replacing incandescent bulbs when you consider all the bulbs that are replaced and the cost of electricity. And asset management for transportation is very similar to that. You may make different decisions in the initial phase of a life cycle because of what it costs to maintain it over time. Now, back in 2012, there was legislation that was passed that set requirements for state departments of transportation to develop transportation asset management plans, which we call TAMPs, at least every 4 years. They're required to include their pavements and bridges on the national highway system in those TAMPs, but they're encouraged to include the entire system that they manage, as well as other assets that they maintain. Now, those TAMPs have to include 10-year investment plans for how they are going to be managing those assets, and they have to develop specific annual plans for how money will be invested in maintenance, preservation, rehabilitation, reconstruction, and new construction. And every year, the DOTs have to submit a consistency report to the Federal Highway Administration that shows that they are actually investing in accordance with that transportation asset management plan. So that introduces an accountability piece into how transportation assets are being managed. Now, asset management is based on the 6 principles that you see on the slide. It's policy driven, and what that means is that decisions are going to be tied to the agency's goal. It's performance-based, so goals are tied to current and future conditions. It's option-oriented. There are a lot of different choices that an agency can make in taking care of its assets. So feasible options are going to be considered in asset management. It's very data-driven, and so we talk about this as being a performance-based approach to managing, but you need data in order to understand performance. And so decisions are going to be based on quality data. It's also risk-based. There's a lot of uncertainty that agencies have to deal with. They don't know how long an asset is actually going to be performing. They also can't control weather, climate change, all of those kinds of things introduce uncertainty. And so you want to try to reduce the impact that these risks might have on your network. And finally, it's transparent. And what that means is people within the organization and even stakeholders outside the organization have a good understanding of what factors are going into the decision process. A couple of years ago, we developed a guide to transportation asset management for local agencies in Indiana, and I provided a link to that if you should want to take a look at it. But it introduced 5 steps to good asset management, and I'm going to walk through each one of those steps. But I also added, on the right-hand side, you'll see sort of a repeat of those 5 steps. But I added the last one, which is implement a sustainable long-term strategy, which I think is actually putting the recommendations into practice. So the first step is just knowing what you have, and that involves developing an asset inventory. And I included a couple of questions that an agency might ask in developing that inventory. Most importantly is the question of what assets are you going to include in your asset management program? Most agencies include pavements and bridges because of the level of investment that they have in those assets. And there are pretty standard processes in place for collecting that information and rating the condition of those assets. But not as many agencies have included those other assets that might be included. So they have to think about them, and where are these assets? How big are they? What are they made of? When was the last time they were repaired? Where are we going to store the information? All those become critical decisions that they have to address. The second step in the process is to assess asset conditions, and there are a lot of different resources available to assess condition. With pavements and bridges, there are fairly standard approaches that agencies can use to collect that information. And at the state DOT level, we're seeing most agencies for pavements are using automated procedures for collecting that data. For bridges, there's still manual inspections that have to be done at least every 2 years. But if you're including other assets in your program, you have to think about how frequently do conditions change. That's going to influence how frequently you do condition surveys. And are there requirements that drive these condition assessments? You might be interested to know that for signs, there are retroreflectivity requirements that agencies have to meet. And so that will drive the type of inspection that's actually going to be done. And it's important to maintain the quality. So how are you going to check the quality and how are you going to maintain that? This is just an example of the type of vans that are being used today to collect some of the pavement information. But it's also possible that these kinds of vehicles can be used for other assets that are visible from the road. So agencies can actually use cameras and in AI to identify signs, guardrails, and other assets along the roadway. The third step in the process is to actually set the targeted level of service or the goals that you want to achieve. So here you have to have some idea of what's expected in terms of condition and performance. And are there any requirements that are going to influence what conditions can be achieved? You also have to think about the public who uses these facilities. What do they expect? How much money is available? And what level of funding is going to be available for me to achieve these goals? So is my target realistic when I consider the funding? So those are the kinds of things that agencies need to think about. The fourth step in the process is to develop the program. And here's where we evaluate some of the different investment options that agencies have to consider. In the state DOTs for pavements and bridges, they have very sophisticated pavement and bridge management programs that are available to help them with this analysis. But in some of the local agencies and for some other kinds of assets, they don't have these same kinds of tools. So they're using simpler tools to do this type of analysis. And I'm going to show you an example of a spreadsheet tool analysis that we use for one state DOT to manage some of its assets. But these are the kinds of programs that can be very simple TAMPs. This is what the Indiana DOT or Indiana local agencies use, where they list the condition, they list the cost, and they list how many miles they're going to fix in each one of those condition categories and how much that's going to cost for their budget. The last step in the process is actually reporting results, and there are a lot of different ways to present that. One of the things that's important to remember is that people that are not engineers, a lot of the people that you have to communicate with, don't understand some of the detailed condition ratings that are used for the assets. So we often present information in terms of good, fair, and poor, simplify it so that they understand what we're talking about. Geographic information systems are very valuable tools for conveying and presenting information. And we're seeing a lot more agencies starting to use these portals or apps to display information about the assets. And the one on the right actually came from the city of Seattle, where you can see information on their assets and see it on a map. So they're making that available to the public these days. Now, I want to quickly walk through an example. I mentioned that for pavements and bridges, we have very sophisticated tools available. But Minnesota DOT has included a number of other assets, those shown on this slide, in their transportation asset management plan. but they don't have necessarily the sophisticated inventories and condition assessments, and they don't have tools to predict what future conditions are going to do. So we helped them with a spreadsheet tool, and Prashant actually was very involved in developing that and led this effort. And I'm going to just illustrate the kinds of information that's needed in order to even do some of the very simplistic analysis for a culvert in this case. So the first step in the process was to identify what are some of the different types of treatments and funding sources that you use. And so in that top graphic, you can see the treatments and whether that treatment is funded using maintenance funding or capital investment. In the bottom graphic, you can see we estimated using Markovian probability matrix the estimated deterioration. If an asset is in good condition, what is the likelihood that in the next year it's going to transition or it's going to stay in good condition? And what's the likelihood that it'll drop to fair condition? So we had to map all of that out. We also had to identify treatment strategies that we wanted to evaluate. One of them was a minimum maintenance strategy where all we're doing is routine maintenance. We also wanted to look at their current approach, which was aimed at just maintaining current conditions, but also a desired approach. What would be needed in order to reach the desired level of service in a period of 10 years? Now, using a spreadsheet tool, we programmed in the percentage of assets in good, fair, poor, and very poor condition that were improved with all of the various treatments. And we did this for the current approach as well as the desired approach. And what you'll see in the first row here is that inspections are done regularly on assets in all different conditions. But some of the repairs are more apt to be done on assets in poor condition. So if you jump down to the CIPP or replacing a trench, that is work that's going to be done on an asset in poor condition rather than something that's done in fair or good condition. And you can see that there's very little that they were doing to assets in fair or poor condition. Now that's their current approach. We also wanted to look at their desired approach. And what you start to see is that there was a lot more work that was being done, more lower cost treatments that were being applied. And so some substantial differences in what they were trying to address. Now, we also had to have an idea of when those treatments are applied, what does it do to the condition? And so what this graphic shows is if an asset, a culvert that's in poor condition receives a slip liner, 10% are going to go to good and 90% are going to go to fair. If they replace the trench, then it will just go up to good condition. So this allows us to forecast what future conditions are going to look like. Then, using a fairly sophisticated spreadsheet tool, we're able to compare the 10-year forecasts of what percentage of the culverts will be in poor and very poor condition under each of the three strategies. And as you might expect, the minimum maintenance strategy has a lot more assets in poor condition than either the current or the desired approach would have. And the current approach, as you can see, is just about maintaining the conditions that they have today. Now, this is another way of looking at the condition distribution. And the top one is the current condition, where they're at today. The second bar graph is the desired approach with their 10-year condition, with no more than 10% of the culverts in poor or very poor condition. And the bottom graphic represents the 10-year forecast of current conditions. So you can see dramatic differences in the amount of assets that's in fair and poor and very poor condition. So these are the kinds of things that we can use to communicate with decision makers as to why they need different levels of investment. This is another way of doing that. And what this was enabled them to do was to show that they needed almost $7 million per year in the 10-year period in order to actually reach the desired condition. So this kind of information is extremely valuable to help agencies plan for their managing of their assets. And the more assets that they're able to have this information, the better off they are in terms of decisions. Now I'm going to shift a little bit to some of the keys to success for successful asset management programs. And I think one of the things that is important is to make data relatable. I mentioned earlier that there's a lot of engineering involved in treatments and managing and analyzing conditions, and a lot of people just don't understand that information, and they just kind of tune us out when we start talking that way. One of the things we've learned, and the Ohio DOT has made a simple video that you can go to and take a look at, but they use very simple, even cartoony illustrations to talk about why they're taking care of what they have and why maintaining those assets is the right thing for them to be doing with available dollars. So making this whole philosophy relatable helps avoid some of the complaints that might go to the mayor, to the elected officials, or other decision makers. I think the other thing that's important is implementing sustainable long-term strategies. And one of the things that we learned when the development of the asset management plans was, while it's one thing to develop a plan, it's another thing to make sure that the agency is actually implementing that plan and putting that plan into place. So a couple of questions that agencies are being forced to think about. Do people throughout the agency understand what their role and responsibility is in terms of implementing the plan? In a lot of agencies, the central office would develop the plan, but it's actually people in the districts that have to implement the plan. And if they don't even know that the plan exists, or they don't understand what they're supposed to achieve, you will not implement what's in that plan. You also have to think about whether processes and tools are in place to support this project selection process. You can't make a plan that isn't supported with the tools that you're using for project selection. So those are the kinds of things that agencies need to think about. They also realize some of the quality of the data just isn't at the level that is needed to manage their network. One of the other keys to success, I think, is to address some challenges and think about asset management as a continual improvement process. These are some of the challenges that agencies had as they were implementing their asset management plans. One is just being able to reliably predict the condition of their assets in a 10-year period. A lot of people didn't have the confidence to be able to do that. Making trade-off decisions across assets. How do you compare an investment in a pavement with an investment in a bridge versus a safety enhancement or a congestion enhancement? So how do you make those kinds of trade-offs? That was a real challenge for them. They were also required to report their investments annually by certain work types. And we found that a lot of the systems in place in DOTs just didn't have the ability to differentiate between whether a repair was a preservation treatment or a rehabilitation treatment. So that was challenging for them. I've already talked about the challenge with implementing the TAMP investments. Adding other assets to the TAMP, that was something that was challenging. And today we're even seeing more challenges in being able to consider extreme weather and resilience and even equity in investment planning. So there's a lot of work to be done in improving these asset management plans. And the graphic on the right just illustrates to you that of 52 agencies, we include Puerto Rico and the District of Columbia in the state grouping, there were 45 states that included only pavements and bridges in their asset management plan. 2 agencies included 1 additional asset, and 5 agencies added 2 or more. So adding additional assets is definitely an area of improvement in the future. I wanted to just let you know a couple of things that are happening in the asset management community in terms of research that's going on and then other outreach activities that are happening. And I'm hoping that by looking at some of these titles of recent research, you'll see that there's actually a broad range of skills that are needed for asset management. Some of the research that's going on is updating the ATPIO Transportation Asset Management Guide. That guide was actually updated a couple of years ago under the National Cooperative Highway Research Program project that was listed there. But there's going to be more changes that they're going to start adding videos. They're going to have more examples of agency practice. So that's an ongoing thing that's going to be available. And I've got more on that in just a few minutes. You can see that we've developed guides for enterprise risk management, financial planning, how to do that. There's a guidebook for data and information systems, how to integrate performance, risk, and asset management practices together. And then you can also see that there are studies going on in how to implement this cross-asset, multi-objective resource allocation, so agencies can make better trade-off decisions between all of the priorities that they're dealing with. We're also seeing more work going on in resilience, sustainability, equity, all of those kinds of things. There's research going on. So whether you're a data geek, whether you're an analyst, whether you're somebody that's better at the big picture, there's a lot going on and a lot of things that you can get involved in asset management. And a lot of change that's going on too. The other thing that we're recognizing is that more agencies are looking to spread the knowledge of asset management within their agencies so that it's embraced and so they have a better understanding of what asset management is, and it just becomes the way the organization starts doing business. One example of that is the Minnesota Department of Transportation recently developed an asset management strategic implementation plan that set their vision, a 5-year vision for where they want asset management to be 5 years from now, what objectives they're trying to achieve, and then they developed specific action plans that could be put in place to help implement that plan. So these are the kinds of things that are going on in asset management, sort of taking us from where we were even just 5-10 years ago to where we hope to be in the next 5 to 10 years. So hopefully you can see that it's an exciting time to be involved in asset management. And regardless of where you are in your career, whether you're just starting it, whether you've been in it for a while, we need people with a lot of different kinds of skills. In addition to engineers, asset management benefits from contributions from communication majors, from data analysts, from economists, from planners, and from data managers. So all of these people, it's very cross-functional in the way that it operates. And so working together with all these people, I think it really helps round us out and come up with better solutions. In closing, I just wanted to touch on a couple of resources that are available if you're interested in asset management. This is an illustration of the ATPIO Transportation Asset Management Guide. I should back up. ATPIO is the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials. It is a non-government organization that is funded by the states, and they are the ones that have published this Transportation Asset Management Guide. And what you can see from this slide is it covers asset management strategy and planning, organization and people, maximizing the performance of transportation assets, resource allocation, monitoring and adjustment, and information and systems. So all aspects of asset management. And one of the things we're most excited about is that we have a digital version of the guide. So I did include the link available, but you can also just Google ATPIO Transportation Asset Management Guide, and you'll be able to find it. And this guide is searchable. You can read an entire chapter, or you can jump from topic to topic. You could just see what practices are in place that agencies are using. So lots of good information available for you. Another resource that's available for you is the ATPIO Transportation Asset Management Portal. Now, this portal is a place for all things asset management. So you can get copies of reports, asset management plans. You can get tools that have been recently developed from some of the research projects that I showed you. Up at the top, you'll also notice that it has an events pull down. And from that pull down, you can find out about webinars that have been held on transportation asset management. You can find out about the conferences on asset management, and there'll be a one in Boston next year. So lots of different kinds of information on asset management that is available to you. One other site that might be helpful to you is the Federal Highway Administration's asset management webpage. And as you can see from the left, you can access guidance on asset management. You can get copies of case studies that they've developed. You can also, through that sort of in the middle of the list, there is a link to transportation asset management plans. All of the asset management plans that were developed in 2019 are there. Those plans are currently being updated. They're all due again in 2022. So you'll have the ability to compare some of the older TAMPs with some of the newer TAMPs to see what kinds of changes have taken place. So lots of good information there. And just a couple of links here if you're interested in any of those websites. You can also, any of these cases, you can just Google them and you'll be able to find out more about those resources. So with that, that's a quick overview of asset management. And I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen, and we can certainly see whether there are any questions that you guys have that you'd like to answer.
All right, Katie, thank you very much for the presentation. We do have a number of questions for you. Some of them pretty loaded and challenging. So let's take them one by one. So the first one, I think you already answered this question partially, but this was a question on what assets beyond pavements and bridges are significant enough in terms of economic investments and repairs. And you did show a number of these assets from a couple of DOTs, but is there anything you want to add on in terms of assets other than pavements and bridges that are of very high value, not just to states, but also at the local level?
Well, one thing I want to mention is it's not necessarily just because they have a high value that you might include them in the program. There might be a safety reason for including them in the program. So for example, things like signs, things like warning boards, the message boards that are on that, those all control traffic operations, and they can be very important from a safety perspective. There might also be factors like culverts. In Ohio, culverts was one of the first ones they wanted to include because they had flooding issues, and they needed to make sure that culverts were cleaned out so that the flooding wasn't as significant. So, the things that I've seen from a safety and risk perspective, things like the culverts, Nevada included ITS assets. I've seen sound walls, high mast tower lighting, tunnels would be another one that they have a huge investment in. Those are some of the, things that come to mind immediately.
All right, thank you, Katie. The next question. So we live in very interesting times today, right? So how do we plan for unplanned investment and developments in the future, right? Like recession, wars, COVID, interest rate uncertainty, climate change. So how do we plan for the unplanned?
Well, that is a tough situation that DOTs are in, and we just experienced a lot of that recently. We do that through a risk assessment, and in each of the asset management plans, they're required to consider these uncertainties, these risks. And there is a process that they can go through that they identify what are some of the common risks that they're dealing with, and they rate those risks in terms of the likelihood that that event will occur and what's the impact if it does occur. And through that combination of likelihood and consequence, they can get an idea of what are going to be the most significant risks that we need to deal with. And then once they have that idea, then they can talk about what can they do to mitigate those risks through treatments, through just a tolerance, through taking advantage of something that might be a positive risk. So they can make a plan for how they're going to do that and who's going to be responsible for that. And then they can monitor it over time to see whether they're making progress. They probably can't completely eliminate risks. That's probably totally unrealistic. But if they can do things that reduce either the likelihood that it will occur or the consequence, then they can make some significant progress. So you may remember all the flooding events, the large storm events that took place in the East Coast several years ago. We're seeing a lot of changes in the way that stormwater can be treated as a way to prevent that same kinds of damage from happening in the future. We're seeing agencies use more resilient materials in their construction and in their design, so that again they're warding off the impact that those risks might have in the future.
All right, thank you, Katie. So the next question is related to prioritizing action. So what type of overarching criteria can a transportation agency apply in prioritizing actions to address competing needs of pavements, bridges, etc., as well as multimodal facilities?
Yeah, that's the key, isn't it? Well, agencies have historically managed each of their assets separately. So like a pavement or a bridge might be managed separately. And what they try to do in prioritizing their work is try to get the most bang for the buck. So these management systems that they use have ways of calculating the benefit associated with a particular possible treatment and the cost of that, so that they can come up with a benefit cost ratio. And that benefit cost ratio allows them to prioritize those that have the most benefit for the dollars that are being expended. Now, you can do that within an asset class. It's more challenging when you're trying to balance those benefits across asset classes and across different safety, congestion, preservation, and all those kinds of priorities. But that's kind of the approach that they're moving. And this multi-objective decision analysis study that's going on is trying to develop some guidance to help agencies with those kinds of things. One of the things that I will mention is that sustainability, resilience, equity, all of those are becoming much more important factors. And so there is a lot of work going on as to how can we consider those factors at the network level when we're talking big picture in making investment decisions. And that's something that I think is really we're just beginning to explore.
And the next question, Katie. So can you, what are some, sorry, I think I already asked this question. So can you give some examples on how transportation agencies are standardizing their reporting practices in terms of reporting asset conditions? For example, a fair payment in Indiana, is that comparable to a fair payment in Colorado or Florida? What are some standardization efforts that have been taking place in the country over the last few years?
So one of the things that's important to understand is that when agencies first got started in, say, pavement management, they each kind of went their own different direction in developing ways of inspecting their pavements based on the kinds of deterioration that they would see. The same is not true for bridges. With bridges, there is a national bridge inventory standard that is followed for all bridges across the country to be inspected. So bridges have a very standardized procedure that is used for local bridges, state bridges. All bridges are assessed with that. So they're fairly consistent, and you can compare bridge conditions from one state or one agency to another. With pavements, we don't quite have that because agencies adopted these different procedures. But the Federal Highway Administration has to report consistent conditions on at least the national highway system to Congress every year. So they implemented some performance measures that state DOTs have to use for reporting pavement conditions on the national highway system, which are the interstates and the highest volume highways in most of the DOTs. Now, that allows them to report consistent conditions. It's based on cracking and faulting and rutting and roughness. But the issue is that now many states are in this dilemma where they report national highway system conditions using the federal highways measures, but for their own internal purposes, they still use their historical methods of assessing condition. So now they have to deal with explaining to people why they have two different ways of reporting condition, and that's created a whole new nightmare for some of these agencies.
All right, thank you, Katie. I think we have the last question here, or a series of questions, which I will call the last question. So in a developing country, a transportation agency in a developing country where we have not really been managing assets using an asset management philosophy or methodology, so where do we start? What are some low-hanging fruits, and what skill set is needed for us to be successful in this area?
I would say that one way to start is by just getting a simple inventory and assessment of the assets that you're maintaining. And you can do some of this by approximation. You can estimate we have approximately 100 miles. I estimate that 25% of it is in good condition, 50% is in fair, 25% is in poor. And with spreadsheet tools, you can start to model what would happen if I maintained it this way? What if I did this? And you can start to make progress. And as you do some work, you can start to build that inventory and make it more accurate. So it's similar to what we're doing with some of these other assets other than pavements and bridges, like the culvert example that I gave you. In a lot of the examples that we're working with agencies, we have to estimate the inventory and we have to estimate the condition. And I would say if you're in an agency that doesn't have a lot of this information, you can start very simply. The asset management guide for local agencies in Indiana has a very, very simple asset management plan that, again, they do have to inventory their network and they have to do a simple assessment, but you can just drive over it and using some guidance, assign a number, a condition score to that road. So again, not very sophisticated, but a good first start. I think the other thing that I would say is look to see whether there are resources that are available. The World Bank does support the development and use of asset management tools. They have developed some tools that are available for developing countries, and that might be another avenue that could be explored. Perhaps there's funding available to help you get started. You might be able to start with your highest volume facilities first. Do your main roads, for example, and master those. And then as you get it down, expand beyond to other parts of your network.
All right, thank you, Katie. So with that, I think we've come to the end of our questions. So I will turn it back to Salil now for us to close this out. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Katie. That was fascinating. And thank you so much for taking the time to go with this excellent webinar. On behalf of ATPIO and personally myself also, I'd like to say a big round of thanks. For everyone on this call, yeah, please do check us out on the LinkedIn page as well as the ATPIO website. And then we'll be sharing the presentation with the attendees. We'll also likely put it up on our website as well. So with that, again, I thank everyone for attending today's webinar, and we hope to see you again on our next webinar, hopefully in October of this year. Thanks, and have a good day. Prashant, any other closing comments?
That's it, Salil. Thank you very much.
All right.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Good day.